Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Raghu Sundaram, the most recent dean of the Stern School of Business at NYU. Under Raghu's leadership, Stern moved up in the rankings from number 13 in 2018 to number 7 in 2024. That is a phenomenal achievement. Raghu is now Senior Vice Chancellor and Head of Global Strategy for NYU, leading NYU's rise as a global player in education. Raghu, welcome to Brave New World. I am truly delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you, Vasant. As you know, I've been following your show for a very long time, and it's really genuinely a pleasure to be here, honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so good to hear. And I've been, we've been talking about having you on the show for a long time, but your deanly responsibilities have, kept this from happening. And now you're done with that, so you can breathe free. And here we are. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you, as am I.
Yeah, actually, talking about dean stuff, like what does a typical day in the life of a dean look like? What do you do all day?
In many ways, it's not different from any other administrative role. I think in other places, you have a very large number of different groups of stakeholders, and in different times, you're focusing on different issues. Sometimes you're looking internally at the school, discussing faculty issues, discussing students, enrollments, student success, how well things are happening. Sometimes you're looking at the alumni, fundraising, donors. As the dean, you play two roles within a university. You are the school's representative to Central University. You're also the university's representative at the school, trying to balance school responsibilities with university responsibilities. You're the school's face to the outside world. You're also, in some sense, the person the outside world looks to contact the school. So the different roles. So a typical day would be lots and lots and lots of meetings.
Yeah. I was going to say, do you get any time to think, or is that something that happens late at night at home?
It took me a year to figure that out. And then I consciously started keeping one day a week aside, which usually got filled up with meetings anyway. But I tried not to do meetings on at least one day a week. And most of my actual thinking work was done on the weekends and the evenings.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the reality.
Yeah, I asked one of my previous podcast guests, not on the podcast itself. I asked Nandan Nilekani, what do you do all day? And he looked at me and says, I think. Yes, I think most of the day. I was like, yeah, that's an envious situation to be in. So, Raghu, let's start with your journey until this point. Where'd you grow up? What influenced you growing up and, set you on the path that you took?
So I grew up in what was then called Madras in India, now Chennai. Pretty conventional upbringing, I think. I was an activist student in school, and also very fond of mathematics and philosophy. Those were my two favorite subjects, reading subjects in school. Wound up getting into economics in my undergraduate. I went to IIM Ahmedabad for my MBA. And while doing my MBA, decided I really wanted to become an academic, and came to the US for my PhD at the age of 22. And did a PhD in economics at Cornell, which was a very conventional path for most Indian professionals who came to the US. The only sort of unusual part of it was that after I did my PhD, I joined the University of Rochester's economics department. I did my PhD in mathematical economics, decision theory, game theory, and did a lot of work in that area, wrote a book on optimization theory, had a successful string of publications, got an NSF grant. Everything was going well. But the year I got tenure, I started rethinking what I was doing. And I realized that I wanted to be a lot more connected to the real world, as it were. And serendipity brought me to NYU, and so I resigned my tenure, and I took up a new job in the finance department at Stern.
So go back a little bit here, because I had no idea that you were such a math nerd. So were you basically like a math guy for the early part of your career? And
I don't know, but I think there's a huge difference between being a mathematician and being somebody who loves mathematics. I think I fall into the latter category. I was pretty good at mathematics.
Yeah.
I was always very good at school level mathematics and stuff. I was pretty good at it. And then I really took it up again when I did my PhD, when I did a decent number of math courses, did my PhD dissertation in stochastic games, went off into decision theory, wrote a number of papers on bandit problems and dynamic programming and areas like that. It was great fun, but there came a point when I started thinking about whether that's really what I wanted to be doing, and then I moved. That's when I moved into finance.
So how did you become a finance prof? Because
that was incredible serendipity. I mean, the role of serendipity in my life, I think, has been greater than in many others that I can think of. But in this case, I'd written a paper called Generalized Bandit Problems. We looked at I'd written a paper on bandits with an infinite number of arms. Then I generalized it.
So hang on a second. So for the people who don't know what a bandit problem is, can you
Yes.
just like reduce it to
Yes. So
English?
The original term bandit problems comes from the slot machines where you pull the arm of the bandit and it either pays off or it doesn't. The notion of a bandit problem got generalized in decision theory to you have the option of pulling multiple arms and you don't know the likelihood of success. And the typical application of this was, for example, to drug testing, where there were several possible treatments and you didn't know which was going to be the most successful treatment, and how do you optimally test between them, and when do you decide which is the most successful arm to pull, so to speak. And at some level, bandit problems had a very clear application when they began. Then it just became the study of decision making. And so I did mention I was getting into more and more abstract problems. I'd written a paper on infinite armed bandits, where you have an infinite number of choices at every point and what would happen in that case. And then in the obvious and useless generalization, I went from a countable to an uncountable number of arms, and that was the paper I'd come to present at NYU. The paper was called Generalized Bandit Problems, and I happened to meet a faculty member from Stern that day. Right after lunch, I was having a conversation, and he was from the finance department. And
who was that out of
this
curiosity?
was Marty Subramanian.
Ah, okay.
And it just complete happenstance that we'd run into each other. And so we talked for a while, and he said, I'd not mentioned anything about what I was doing or anything, just that I was in Mathicon. And he said, have you ever thought of coming to a finance department? And truthfully, I didn't even know what people in finance did. So I said no. And he said, you should think about it. And I said, yeah, I'd probably be interested in thinking about it. 3 months passed. And then I was in Rochester one day. I get a call from the chair of the economics department, Marty Gruber, who says, you've been recommended to me as a potential visitor. Would you like to visit? So, as I told you, I'd already been thinking about what I really wanted to be doing. And so this seemed like a plausible idea. But I told him, Marty, I don't know anything about finance. And Marty tells me, that's all right. We don't know anything about you either, but we'll both learn about each other. So why don't you come? So I said, sure. So I landed up here in, I think, October or November of 94. And in Jan 95, I started teaching. I was learning finance as I was teaching it, one class ahead of time. There is nothing like the fear of making an ass of yourself in the classroom to make you learn subjects really So every week I was like mastering the subject before I went to the class. By February, apparently the department liked what they'd seen enough that they made me an offer to stay. What they didn't know was that in the interim, I'd actually received tenure at Rochester. Obviously, they couldn't make me a tenured offer. I didn't have a single paper in finance. I didn't even know what the subject was. So when I told them that, we both started rethinking the whole thing. And then I thought about it and said, I wanted to try a new path anyway, so let me resign my tenure. So I resigned my tenure and I accepted the untenured offer.
We've known each other a long time, and, to me, you were sort of a regular guy, a faculty member. And then you just sort of went into, sort of university leadership, and you became a dean, and now you're, going for into a new role at the university level. Is this something you had envisioned happening?
I don't think so. I think every one of us, I mean, in my case, certainly not, but I don't think anyone actually does. Most of us get into academia because we like the idea of setting our own research agenda, the idea of setting our own work parameters. What is it that interests me? What would I like to do? Nobody gets into academia with the idea that I want to become an administrator and I want to become a dean and I want to become a provost or a university president or something. That happens along the way. In my case, that was, again, serendipity. I mean, it was, I was very happy being a professor. So my in 2007-8, I had a personal setback when my wife was diagnosed with a fairly lethal form of cancer. And so that was a very difficult 4 or 5 years. And about a couple of months after she passed away, for whatever reason, I found myself a member of the faculty senate. And the university then in 2012, you remember, was going through some really difficult times with all the votes of no confidence.
Yes, I remember those times. In fact, we were on some of the same committees at that time.
Of course, yes. So I was in the Senate, and somebody in the Senate came up and asked me, are you interested in becoming a candidate for chair of the Senate? And truthfully, I'd only attended 2 Senate meetings or 3 Senate meetings at that point. I'd just joined the Senate, and the meetings were once a month. And initially I said no, and then I said, I knew the turmoil that was going on that was even dividing the Senate. So I said, okay, I'll be a candidate. Next thing I knew, I'd won the election. And that's when I actually started getting much more involved in what was happening at the university and everything else. And the second year, there was no candidate against me. I won a re-election. It was a really difficult period because the university was very divided on a number of fronts. And as the chair of the Senate, you're expected to bring people together into consensus and everything. And things, I think, worked reasonably well. But then I went back to just being a faculty member at Stern. And then somewhere in 2015, my predecessor, Peter Henry, reached out and said, would you like to be the vice dean for MBA programs? Now, I got to know Peter well later and got to really respect him later. But at that time, I didn't know Peter particularly well. It turned out that it was John Sexton who suggested that he talk to me as a possible candidate for taking over MBA programs. And John had met when I was in the faculty senate. So it was one coincidence after another that led to this. So I took over as vice dean for MBA programs. And you remember those 2 years, and things, I think, started clicking together. So when Peter decided to step down, I'll confess, I thought about it a very long time of, do I want to become dean? Because I'd seen the kind of stresses that he was being put through, and I said, do I want to go through this? And ultimately I did. And I had a wonderful 6 years. I mean, absolutely no complaints. It was, very trying times, COVID and all, but overall it was a great time. But
yeah, I do recall those meetings, those Senate meetings, and the fact that you were a pretty amazing consensus builder, and that was something that was needed in that sort of environment. So it's not surprising to me that you ended up become the dean at the Stern School, and to be quite honest, I haven't, I've been here a long time. I've seen many deans, but I haven't come across anyone with the same kind of combination of, strategic thinking and sort of details that you seem to.
Thank you. That's very nice of you.
Because you're sort of simultaneously a details-oriented person as well. So.
Thank you. I think it's largely just the background, right? I think, when the kind of work you do, data becomes very important to the way you think and structure and so on.
Yeah, and it's pretty obvious, just by talking to my colleagues that you've done a fairly phenomenal job, and you will be missed, and you're going to be a hard act to follow. But let's go back to what was new about becoming a dean? I mean, you became a dean of a major business school. How did you think about it? Like, what was new and different, and how did you get your head around it?
That's actually a very good question. I think academia is a little peculiar in that you take somebody who's been a professor all their lives, and then you convert them into instant deans, and there's no training on or most of it is on the job, as it were. I'd been vice dean for 2 years. So you think you've seen what the dean does, and you think you have an idea what being the dean is going to be like. But as vice dean, what you're responsible for is one vertical, so to speak, one part of the school. And it's very hands-on operational responsibility of, as you know, at that time, the MBA market was going through this pretty severe decline. And for us, especially at Stern, the part-time MBA market was very badly hit. So we were going through some very difficult times. And the idea was, how are we going to address those? How are we going to get out of that hole? And so you're very hands-on operationally in dealing with the admissions people, with the job placements people, with the student experience, with in designing coursework, faculty, reaching out to new possible areas of interest, everything. When you become dean, what you realize is you have influence, not power. What you don't talk to the admissions people directly anymore. You only go through your vice deans. You don't talk to there's almost nobody you talk to directly. And that's what first thing you miss, because when I got data weekly updates on every aspect of the school, and I used to pour over the data, but I couldn't just pick up the phone and call the admissions person and say, like, why did we see this trend, or why are you seeing that trend, or on the placement side, or in the it takes some time to understand that that's not your job anymore. Your job is not to keep interfering in like the minutiae of how the school is operating. You need to have a team. And I was blessed in having an amazing team of people that I could trust completely to do what needed to be done. So that was one part of it. The second part of it is you're not quite conscious how much you are now wearing multiple hats. When you're vice dean, you're wearing one hat, which is internal facing and responsible for I was in the MBA program, so I was looking at graduate programs, and I was looking at the graduate experience from soup to nuts, but that was it. Suddenly, you're now the face of the school to the alumni. Something happens in the school that they don't like. The first person they write to is the dean. You're the face to the donors. You're the face to the university. When the university has any concerns about what is going on or any issues they would like to raise with Stern, you're the person that they reach out to. So you're suddenly the face of the university to almost every single stakeholder. You find yourself reporting to 100,000 people, 90,000 alumni, the 6,000 students who are in the school, the 300 faculty, the 300 administrators, the entire university, the board. You're now reporting to everybody. And that takes a little bit of time, I think, getting adjusted to the fact of trying to balance all these stakeholder interests in what you're trying to do.
Yeah, this notion of having the right team is just so critical, isn't it?
Oh, I think...
Because you're basically trusting everyone on that team with whatever they're responsible for.
100%. You can never be... I think this is almost a tautology. You can never be better than your team. You can be worse, but you can never be better than your team. And we just had an amazing team of people in our vice dean's group when I was dean. I think getting... people who understand not only their areas but work as a group together. We really gelled very well together.
So, you talked earlier about the fact that the MBA program was in there was a high degree of uncertainty. Applications had been declining. Where's it now relative to where it was then? The MBA degree. I mean, is it perceived similarly? Is it on the rise? Where is it?
I think relative to 2015, I think across the board, the MBA is in a much stronger position. And for Stern, it's far stronger position than it was in 2015. I think several things happened in the 2010s for Stern. The 2008-9 crisis, and if you think back to what Stern was in the run-up to the financial crisis, we were a school that essentially had only 2 degrees. We had the undergrad degree and we had an MBA degree, except the MBA came in 3 flavors. We offered it as an exec MBA, as a part-time MBA, and as a full-time MBA. The full-time MBA, of course, is the flagship program, but the part-time MBA was an enormous importance to us because we got this steady flow of students from Wall Street, the analysts who needed an MBA to get promoted to associates, and they would go back to Wall Street. And they were largely back office people who wanted to move to the front office. So both supply and demand were taken care of in the part-time MBA. They were sponsored by their companies. So Goldman alone used to send, if I remember right, 30 to 35 students a year to get their MBAs. If you think about the fact that an average part-time MBA is 3.5 years, you multiply 30 by 3.5, you're looking at over 100 Goldman people in the program at any given time. My numbers could be a little bit off, but not too much off. Post 2009, companies took away sponsorship altogether, where they used to send people for their MBAs. And so suddenly sponsorship dried up. And when sponsorship dried up, demand for the part-time MBA started collapsing. So it became largely a self-pay issue. And demand for MBAs on Wall Street, also outside of investment banking, the sales and trading jobs, the private wealth management jobs, the MBA was no longer a key part of the requirement. So when you and I came to Stern, we used to send 25 people to currency trading jobs alone a year. Right. Currency trading had died even before the financial crisis. And so suddenly sales and trading jobs dried up and Wall Street demand fell. Supply from Wall Street fell because Wall Street was not sending people anymore. So the part-time MBA had halved in application size between 2010 and 2015 or 16, and the enrollments were down to 40% of what they were. And because that was such a large program for us, equal in size to the full-time in terms of annual number of graduates, our finances got really badly hit. And so one part of the challenge we faced then was trying to make that program revive. But that's one part of our challenge. A more global challenge was applications to the MBA across the country had been trending down for a while. Across the entire country, the number of people taking the GMAT, just as with the JD, applications nationally had been trending down. That, of course, first hits the lower ranked schools, and then slowly the wave started lapping up against higher ranking schools also. And you saw some schools even ranked in the 20s deciding to shutter their full-time MBA program, like Illinois, for example, a few others. Wisconsin announced they were doing it and then withdrew their decision. But there was a lot of thought about what is the future of the full-time MBA. But that started turning around in the latter half of even the last decade. Because a new group, the demand for MBA came about from, I think if you look at the kind of students who are applying now to the kind of students who were applying 20 years ago, there's a vast difference. So now you get a very large number of students who are looking to change the direction of their careers. Some, for example, moving from non-profits to moving to the for-profit industry. So there's a vast difference in the kinds of students that we get because of the changing nature of the demand for MBAs in the market. But overall, the MBA market has revived decently. And for Stern, this year, for example, our full-time MBA applications were up 46% on last year.
So it's become more general in that sense, the MBA. It used to be sort of, at least we were mostly finance-oriented, and so now it seems to become general. Tech came into the picture. Because I remember,
that is correct.
There was one time when, I think some of the, I may get my years wrong, but I think like around 2010, 2009, where some MBA students were talking about going to work for Apple and Google, and people thought they were crazy. Like, why would you go work for, one of these big tech companies?
Yeah, that was especially true in the 1990s when I remember a friend of mine who went to work for Microsoft in the mid-90s, and people thought he was crazy. He said, why would you go to work for Microsoft after he did his MBA at MIT? And it turned out to have been a wonderful decision exposed. But in the 1990s, Stern was largely a finance school, and it remained largely a finance school in perception, all the way into, I think, about 2010, 11, 12. The perception of Stern was this is where you went if you wanted to get to Wall Street.
Yeah.
One part of what we had to do in the second half of the last decade was alter that perception, because as you and I both know, having been here a long time, finance is a very major and very strong part of Stern, but we have many other really excellent top-rated departments that we needed to highlight. So part of reorienting the school around tech, around consulting, around other areas, but primarily around tech, was highlighting the strengths that we already had, but that were not receiving enough attention because of the the perception that this was a finance school. So the fact that...
I guess the market wasn't really ready yet then either, right? I mean, the market for that developed also, like, I guess in the last 15 years, right? The tech jobs,
yes, in the last 15 years.
And things like that, right?
No, 100%, I agree with you. But it was also important to catch it as it was developing. And so, for example, getting Amazon to come here, getting Microsoft to come, it was the initial conversations always began with, but your students are interested only in finance. And we said, no, they're very smart students. Come and take a look. And within 3 years of Amazon first recruiting our students, they were our number one employer. So that was a point of some pride for me that in 2018, they already became our number one employer. So of the last 5 years, I think, if I could get my numbers wrong, I think McKinsey has been our number one employer 2 of the last 5 years, and Amazon the other 3. And nobody would have thought of a non-finance firm being a top employer at Stern 15 years ago, 10 years ago.
I guess you also sort of made a move into specialized programs, right? Because that was an important part of the portfolio, almost like a hedge and diversification, right? So say more about that, because I sense that just there was a flurry of sort of activity in specialized programs.
No, it was a very conscious decision at that point that... So as I mentioned, we really wanted to highlight our strengths in tech. One of the ways we did it was starting the Tech MBA. It achieved 2 things. One is, as I've already mentioned the context that the part-time MBA had become much smaller than it used to be, and we had all these headroom in these classes. So starting a 1-year focused MBA around tech, for those who were very clear on their career path that this is the area they wanted to get into, gave us, I think, 2 things. One is it attracted a very different kind of student than we were traditionally getting. And second is it highlighted the tech strengths of Stern. We created an advisory board that brought in people from Amazon, from Microsoft, from Google, but also from Wall Street, from the tech side of Wall Street, the chief technology officer of Goldman Sachs, the chief technology officer of Citigroup. They were all on the advisory board that set it up. And the program was set up very deliberately around a program focused entirely around technology and entrepreneurship. But it was an MBA. It was a general purpose MBA in the sense that you did the same kind of general core, and then you went into your specialization was predetermined because you joined the Tech MBA. That program has proved enormously successful for us. Applications have increased some 4-fold since we launched it in 2018, and I think it's now a very critical part of the school in many ways. But what it did was also have a very nice feedback effect onto the other MBA programs of the school in terms of highlighting, bringing in tech firms and getting the students interested in tech as well as getting the tech firms interested in our students. So there was a deliberate thought process that went into it. It was both part of diversification but part of hedging also against further decline in the 2-year MBA.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the undergrad program, which I find really interesting, by the way. I just taught an undergrad class last semester, and it was probably one of the best, most fun experiences I've had. And I say this because, when we were growing up, people didn't tell us to go to business school. I mean, that was not something you really thought about, like for your undergrad, right? People say, do math or do science or do engineering, especially in India, right? Yes. Do something useful. That'll get you a job. And to be quite honest, I never used to advise people to go get an undergrad in business. I mean, I certainly didn't advise my kids to do that. I wouldn't advise other kids to do that. And yet I see the undergrad kids here at Stern incredibly bright, very broad sort of in their orientation and willing to sort of engage with you and think. What's changed?
That's a good question. I think what I can certainly say is what business education is today, there is still a perception amongst people of a certain generation that an undergraduate in business is, it's a trade school.
Yeah, exactly.
It long ago ceased being that. Our students do the same liberal arts core as students from every other part of the university. But we also uniquely have a social impact core that links business to society, and it's in the broader picture. It's a mandatory core of 4 courses. 48% of the credits on average that a Stern student has at graduation time, 48% of the credits come from the liberal arts. It's not any different from doing a degree in any other specialized subject where you get a very thorough grounding in the liberal arts and then you get a specialization. That specialization happens to be finance or computer science, happens to be philosophy or history. It's being built on a foundation. And I think in a very real sense, business school education today, as I've already mentioned, it rests on the same foundation as any other degree. But business school education today has also realized the importance within the business school of also being much more broad-based in what one is doing. And certainly our degree has changed dramatically over the last 25 or 30 years. And as the result of conscious thought process into what we're doing, we introduced the social impact code more than 20 years ago. And it's not only about teaching students about the liberal arts, but since they are in a business school, about how business is connected to society, about how law, business, and society interact. How does professional responsibility interact with being a business leader? These are all courses that we actually do. And a surprising number of students at the end of their undergraduate years choose one of the 4 social impact core courses as the course that most influenced them.
Very interesting how business school education has broadened over the years to include a significant liberal arts component, social responsibility, tech, etc. So, Raghu, I want to segue into the role of a university education more broadly. One of my previous podcast guests, Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan, said that a major role of university education is to maximize the number of serendipitous encounters, which really resonated with me. How do you think about it, considering how serendipity has played a major role in your career?
So you'd mentioned Michael Roth's comment to me once, and I spent so much time thinking about it after that on what a brilliant description that was. For many of us, right? So the best friends we have are the ones we went to school with, the ones we went to college with, the ones not necessarily were in the same classroom with, but the ones who were with us in the dorms, the ones we roomed next to or the ones we roomed with. You make amazing friendships, but also intellectual collaborations, contact, everything that comes about. It's just truly fantastic. I think the role of university is something very, very broad. From an individual perspective, certainly that serendipity is a very hugely attractive part of why one wants to be at a university.
Well, actually, now that I think of it, anywhere, because I went to a boarding school, and my class size, it was a co-ed boarding school, there were 60 of us, and we spent, let's say 8 years of our lives as kids together. And a lot of us are still incredibly close, right? Because the education just sort of happened. You learned the math and the physics and stuff along the way.
Almost by osmosis, as it were. But that's why I said school, college, everywhere. I think it's dorms. Those networks that get built up, the amount of the role that chance plays in the people you run into and how the role they play in your lives is just quite remarkable.
So, this reminds me of something related, which is, about I said 10, 12 years ago, these massive online education platforms started cropping up. And I actually thought that they were going to be massively disruptive to higher education, disruptive to, universities, and, even organized a workshop here at Stern with some of my colleagues and John Sexton and, Clay Christensen and, and people from Udemy, the platforms. And that didn't happen, because there was a lot of sort of hype about that at one point, right? Just this sort of massive online education, you don't need to spend $50,000, you can get it for free. You have access to the best professors online, right? All of these things seemed really compelling, right? And yet it just sort of just went away, or at least, wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. So I look back at that and say, well, I was like so badly wrong on that. Why do you think that happened?
I think wrong is not the expression I would use. I think one of the things that universities do, people always think of the classroom experience. But the classroom experience is one aspect of the university experience. Coming and sitting in a classroom and learning from some amazing people is really one aspect of it. But even the classroom experience, so much of your learning takes place in interaction with your classmates and other things. But a university life is a lot more than just the classroom itself, right? It is, I think of it as the friends you make and the network you meet. But ever since you mentioned Michael Roth's statement to me, I now think of it as the value of serendipity. The networks that you build and the networks you get access to through the alumni network, for example. You went to IIT Delhi, right?
Yes.
So you talk to somebody 20 years away from you, but you introduce yourself as from IIT Delhi. There's an immediate link that takes place.
Absolutely.
That network opens out to you in a way that is quite amazing. But there is something more about going to a university than that, right? So without meaning to pick on the online companies, because I think they do a remarkably good job in many ways. When Udacity and Coursera and others started, I'm talking about many years ago, they would have impressive numbers like 100,000 people have registered for this course. But then the completion rate used to be like 1% and 2% and something pretty low. One of the things about universities is you take a course, you show that you have the stamina to do 14 weeks of it and then to get a good grade in it. That I'm going to start this job, finish this job. Then I'm going to specialize in a subject. I'm going to do higher and higher levels of it. So there are a number of signals you're sending out about yourself, your capabilities and other things, but also the number of things the university is giving you, the selectivity that you crossed to get in, the grades that you got when you were there, the networks that you build, the alumni network that opens up to you, the assistance with job placement, the assistance with continuing ed. There's so many other things that are built in. And I think one of the challenges online interaction in general is facing, and I'm not going to say, I'm not going to only talk about online education, is that online interaction is yet to figure out a way to have the richness of face-to-face interaction. We do a committee meeting around a table. Those side conversations you have with the person sitting next to you play such a valuable role into feeding your overall impact of a meeting. When you and I attend academic workshops, the conversations you have in the corridor after that workshop about the paper you just listened to, or you attend a conference and those conversations you have over dinner about a paper that was presented at the conference, spark so many new ideas, so many new papers. Those we still haven't figured out a way to make that happen online. When you do an online meeting with 8 people, it's very wooden interactions. Everybody is listening to the person you're talking to. You can't have those side conversations. You can do chats. It's not the same thing as watching facial expressions, watching eye rolls, watching everything else. So to me, the richness of interaction online, it's possible to create, for example, a very rich learning environment, but not the kind of human interactivity yet we haven't figured out how to create that.
Yeah. It's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking that, I mentioned this class that I had really a lot of fun in last semester, but what really made it fun was the fact that, I don't know, there were like maybe 20 out of my 60 students who were like hyperactive. Like, I wish all 60 were, but, 20 is plenty
number,
good.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think they really felt like they learned from each other and they would love to come to class, not necessarily to listen to me, but like to listen to each other, talk about something. And it's sort of ironic that I'm saying this after COVID, right? Because we taught several cycles of COVID, which was okay, but much more challenging because you got to sort of keep the energy. But it misses that interaction among the students. And yet at the same time, I think that one of the great things about COVID is that we can have these Zoom meetings, which works really well for lots of things.
I
right?
agree.
And so it's interesting to see how the technology has sort of enabled us to be a lot more productive in some ways, when it comes to meetings, stuff like that, where people don't need to come together, to meet, that a lot of that stuff you can still get a lot, but not the classroom experience. It just is very difficult.
Not the full classroom experience. I'll put it this way. You began by talking about your own thoughts about online learning 2 decades ago. I think heading into COVID, there were largely 2 opinions about online learning, right? There were the people who thought everything could be done online perfectly, and there were people who, we both know colleagues like this, who thought nothing could ever be done online. Largely, people fell into one of two camps. I never want to do anything online versus online is going to ruin all of us. It's going to take over our lives. What COVID taught us was the truth lay somewhere in between. There were some things that could be done very well online, and we've learned to do that.
Yeah.
And we don't rely on in-person interaction always. And we do many of those meetings online because it's much more efficient to do it. And there are also some things that don't work well online, where we need to get across around a table and we need to thrash things out. So I think that's been the biggest learning experience for me from COVID.
Yeah, I'm chuckling to myself because I remember at one of the department meetings, my chairman said something like, now that students can roll out of bed and come to class, he said something like they've tasted blood. And they feel like, oh, that's a great way to do it, but. So that gave me a chuckle, but it did take some convincing also to students that they'd be a lot better off just coming to class as opposed to, like doing it from home. You just don't get that.
But think of those 20 students in your class.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you can't replicate that. So Raghu, let's talk about the costs of American university education, especially at schools such as ours. One of my previous guests, Caitlin Zaloom, wrote a book called Indebted, where she chronicles how students take on massive debt, which can burden the whole family. How much of a problem is this in American university education?
It's a very real and very substantial problem, but I think it's a question that can be looked at in very many levels, right? A very glib and misleading answer to the question would be to point out that I don't know the exact numbers, but I think from the federal numbers, the average federal loans held by an undergraduate are about $25,000 or so, 24,000, I think. The median is around 28 or 29,000. And you look at the value of a college education, it's been estimated at $1 million or more over a lifetime. So you think you're borrowing $25,000 to create $1 million in value? This is a no-brainer. That's a very glib and, as I said, misleading way to think about it. The real problem comes when one gets into the details of what is the cost versus what is the benefit. And I think here there are a number of ways of thinking about it. It remains to me an unambiguous truism that for most of us in this world, the way to economic advancement is through education and opening up opportunities. There are a few brilliant people who become entrepreneurs with no education, who become really successful at what they do. But for most of us, the best route to advancement is through education. So we want to keep those routes to education open to everybody, not just as many people as possible. We want to make it open to everybody. But there is a cost of providing that education. Education is expensive because you hire faculty, you hire administrative support structure, and it's expensive. There have been complaints that universities are getting too administrator heavy, all of that may have some truth to it, but it's still, we are hiring a highly talented group of people who could probably make much more money in the private sector, but choose for lifestyle reasons to come to the higher education sector. So education costs money. We need to make it affordable. But here there are two, I think, conflicting things to take into account. Education is very much a public good. You look at the incredible ecosystems that get built around universities and their knowledge dissemination. You look at Stanford and the ecosystem in the Bay Area, for example. Universities have a tremendous positive externality wherever they are because universities not only disseminate knowledge, they create knowledge and for the most part make it publicly available. We take pride in putting our papers out as soon as we write them. We want everyone to know we've written them. On the other hand, education is also a private good. When yes, society benefits, but I benefit the most because I'm the one who reaping the rewards of my education. So is it fair that you should bear some of the cost of that education? I think so, but wherever possible, it is, I think, the university's duty to try and level the playing field, not just make education affordable to those who can pay the price. And here the picture gets a lot more complicated when you move away from averages. The average federal debt, I think the numbers I've seen are about $24,000 or so. As I said, the median is about $27,000. But when you look at the distribution, it's actually enormously varied in so many different ways. So there's a paper that was written under the Brookings Foundation's Hamilton Project by Susan Dynarski. She's a professor at Michigan, writes wonderful stuff around education. In that paper, she points out that I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. This is a 2016 paper, so the numbers are a little dated. That 69% of students who graduate from college have less than $10,000 in debt. 98% have less than $50,000 in debt. But there is a very long right tail. So that's one aspect of it, that the distribution of debt is very uneven.
So how do we get this really long right tail? What accounts for that? But you're
That's
talking about
the point I'm getting to. So there are some historically disadvantaged groups, for example, who have to borrow more because we are only talking about borrowing after what the family puts up from its own resources. Right. And some of us are fortunate to come from families that could put up more resources, but people who come from families that don't put up those resources have to borrow much more to go through the college experience. So the debt buildup, for example, amongst some minority groups is much larger than amongst some majority groups. So the distribution is actually, it's very important to understand the distribution of debt, not just look at averages. As I said, you look at the average, it looks like a no-brainer. Why would you not want to do a college education? But the second aspect of this is also what you do in college, and that is a very individual and almost a lifestyle choice decision. There is a paper written by 3 NYU academics a few years ago from the Steinhardt School that looked at the returns to education in different majors. And they found that if you do a major in computer science and engineering, your returns to education are on average 13% a year for life, which is an outstanding return. If you do it in business or social sciences, it's about 10 to 11% a year. But if you do it in the arts, arts and humanities, it's 5 to 8% a year, which is barely break even, kind of return. So if you look at averages, this all gets missed out. You're looking at on average earnings versus average cost. Now, if you're in that right tail and majoring in an area...
So that's really interesting. So it's like, well, borrower beware, right? It's just like, what's the earning potential of whatever, education you're going for, and sort of be mindful of that. This reminds me of my conversation with John Sexton about this. I brought this up with him also. One of the things he said that I thought was kind of interesting was that you have to decide whether you want the whole symphony. That research universities tend to be expensive, and maybe you don't want everything that they offer, right? That his view was that you can actually get a decent education if you're careful, and you look for it, and you can actually, if you're clear about what you want, you can probably find it at an affordable price. And so when I think about what he said, what you're saying, and what my conversation with Caitlin, the thing I'm putting together is that, yeah, borrow beware. This is a space with all kinds of, that there are, people who want to give you loans, right? There are loan servicing institutions making fees off of these things. So I guess it just sort of boils down to...
I think so, but I would actually caveat that a little bit. So John is one of the people I admire most in this world, and I truly love my conversations with him. But occasionally, I find myself in some kind of disagreement with him, at least in the way you're paraphrasing what he said. Here is my point, right? American education is so incredible because it opens up optionality to you in a way that is almost not available in any other country. Like in India, when we went for our undergrads, we chose our major before we joined our undergrad. And if mathematics wasn't what interested you after you joined your undergrad in mathematics, it was not easily possible for you to shift to doing an undergraduate in history or an undergrad in mechanical engineering or doing anything else. One of the loveliest things about American undergraduate system is that it offers you optionality. But to fully explore that optionality, you don't yet know what you want. So yes, it is true that if you know what you want, you don't go to the symphony, you go to a smaller buffet table, or whatever the analogy that you want to use is. But if you don't yet know what you want, and you're bright enough to get into one of the most selective colleges, there is tremendous temptation for you to go there. And that is why I'm saying colleges also have a moral obligation to make it as much as they can. Not everybody can do it because colleges have very different resources. But as much as they can, it is their duty to try and make it affordable, because that aspect of providing choice to me is the most incredible part of an undergraduate. When you look at what undergraduate students, what high school students say they want to do when they come for their undergraduate versus what they actually major in, there's an enormous shifting that takes place. Because what you say or what you think you want to do is based on what you've already experienced about different subjects. But almost by definition, you don't know what you don't know.
Indeed.
And it's only by experimenting you learn, but you want to have the option to experiment. If I go to a small college that offers me only 5 subjects, my ability to experiment and learn is much less. So in a sense, I mean, all these are choices. You go to a liberal arts college, you'll get an outstanding education in a different environment from when you go to a large research university.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's. I agree. I mean, we sometimes forget how clueless we were as to what we really wanted early in life.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like you have no idea because you have no idea what the possibilities are.
Absolutely.
So coming back to this notion of research universities, right, where this is so dominated by American universities, right? The research universities and a handful of them in Europe. Right? Why is it so difficult to create this? Because I know that Indian institutions, for example, I mean the IIT is great, turn out great undergrads, but just like abysmal in terms of like research gravitas and impact, right? So what is it that makes it so hard?
Well, you mentioned one part of it already at the beginning, that creating a research university is expensive. Creating the research environment, giving faculty lots of time to just do their research, that's expensive, but that's at the individual university level. But one can't create a research university in a vacuum. You need other research universities to interact with. So universities operate in ecosystems. If I decided that I want to set up, I don't know, a world-class university in, since you mentioned India, let me say in India. Let's say I want to set it up in Baroda. The faculty there will want to know who they're going to be interacting with, because for all of us in academia, face-to-face interaction at conferences and everything else is very important, and you don't want to feel isolated where you are. So I think creating a research ecosystem is very important rather than creating one. And universities are very funny institutions, right? They compete very fiercely with each other. But when it comes to tenure decisions, to whom do they reach out to find out whether they should tenure somebody? They reach out to their competitors. Can you imagine, for example, Weil Gotshal reaching out to Cravat saying, should I promote this person to partner?
That's
or
pretty
Morgan
hilarious.
Stanley reaching out to JP Morgan saying, how about making this person an MD? We encourage our faculty to work with faculty from other universities. We encourage our faculty to reach out to Columbia and work with faculty from there, to work with faculty from Wharton, from Yale, from Chicago, everywhere. But we compete with them all the time for faculty. We compete for students. We compete for faculty. So universities are very different from other industries in this respect, that ecosystem is very, very important to create. It's expensive to create. When much of the rest of the world outside America and Europe was a much poorer world, you had the option of investing in the creation of knowledge or investing in the dissemination of knowledge. But at that time, maybe it was a false choice. I think most people didn't think they could do both. So they invested a little bit in knowledge creation, but very largely in knowledge dissemination. So India created an amazing number of institutions like the IITs, the IIMs, the Indian Institute of Science, the TIFR, a whole bunch of institutions that were really excellent in, some focused on knowledge creation like the TIFR and others, but most focused on knowledge dissemination, where the target was to get in the most competitive process you could find to get in the students, and then sort of you let nature take its course, as it were. Today, you find lots of outstanding research institutions. For example, in China, you always found them in Japan. Japan always had many great ones. Korea has some really fantastic ones. And China has now developed many terrific research institutions. But it's taken conscious effort of developing not one but an ecosystem of institutions with a conscious decision to invest in research. And Indian universities are distinctly heading in that direction from the conversations that I've been having. I think there's more and more a recognition of how far behind we've fallen in research.
And is that, are they trying to do it through partnerships with American University? In fact, this is sort of segues into, I wanted to ask you what your new role is going to be at the university now that you're done being a dean and you've moved on to sort of larger pastures. What are you going to be doing? I mean, can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I don't know. You asked two parts of the question about the first part about Indian universities reaching out to foreign collaborators.
Right.
I think there's some of that going on for sure. I mean, so my own conversations with them, all of them are looking to actively partner around research, postdocs, PhDs, faculty exchanges, student exchanges. I think there's a lot of openness to collaboration, and that's really wonderful to see. My own role, so it's largely about helping the president formulate strategy around various aspects of the university. It's not restricted to any one area. So, for example, my first task, as was mentioned in the announcement about my appointment, is rethinking the whole university's budgeting system, the financial system through which universities are like conglomerates. You have a very large number of verticals, which are the schools, and there's the central administration, and the idea is how to do the budgeting process in a way that incentivizes schools to manage their own finances better, but also provides center with enough funding to fund its own initiatives and strategic directions and other things. So that's the first task I've taken on. I've been working on it for several months now. One other thing that I've also taken on is as part of NYU's global strategy. So we're also thinking about establishing a physical footprint in India. As you know, we have 2 full campuses outside in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai, but we also have a number of study away sites for our students. London and Madrid and Buenos Aires and Tel Aviv and Accra and elsewhere. So we are thinking about starting a site in India that will function as a study away site for our students, but will also serve as a platform for our many schools to interact with Indian institutions, educational institutions, policymakers, corporates, individuals, everybody.
It's amazing how university education's gone global, isn't it? I mean, this was sort of Sexton's brilliance like many years ago, and there was a lot of resistance to it at the time, but I thought that was such a visionary move on his part.
Yeah, in retrospect, I think there's not a single person who questions that it was visionary, but yes, at that time there was a lot of resistance because universities for hundreds of years, you wanted to study at Oxford, you went to Oxford. Oxford was not going to open a branch for you in
come to us
in India or in Nigeria or you had to go there. Yeah. Every university, you wanted to experience them, you went to where they were. Now you're getting this NYU. I think it was absolute brilliance on John's part to change the conversation about what a university is by taking NYU global. But you're increasingly seeing other institutions do that also, not just American institutions. So IIT Madras, I don't know whether you know this, opened a campus in Zanzibar last year. It's the first IIT to open, and they decided to open it in Zanzibar.
Well,
and,
IIT Zanzibar.
It's called IIT Madras in Zanzibar. But
I guess it'll be Zanzibar Institute of English. It'll be ZIT, right? You can't have an
Tanzanian Institute of Technology, right? But I don't know what. It's called the Indian Institute of Technology Madras in Zanzibar right now. So, it's, and IIT Delhi has just, I think, announced their plans to open one in Dubai, or they might have already opened, I don't know. But lots of institutions are thinking of doing this. So the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, KAIST, mentioned that they have 4 I could be wrong on my data on this, but they have 4 campuses, including at least one in Africa, where they are trying to set up science and technology campuses in parts of the globe that don't have deeper science and technology yet, so that they can make it accessible. So lots of institutions are thinking more globally now.
Yeah, well, John was
20 years ahead of
Yeah, exactly. He was like way ahead. This also reminded me of something that I heard Jim March, who was an organization theorist at Stanford, say about universities. He says, universities aren't like businesses. They're like temples. which was sort of an interesting way of putting it. And, when I thought about why MOOCs had not sort of overrun universities because, through their online product, it made me think of, Jim March's remark, that this isn't just about efficiency. There's something special about university. I thought temple was a sort of an interesting metaphor.
I might be tempted to use a slightly different metaphor. It's more like an ashram. You want to experience the original ashram, but you can create versions of it elsewhere.
True indeed. Coming back to like where we started, and your college education. You mentioned you were an activist. Like, what were you active about? What did you really care about?
I think so. I was 1975 June when India experienced its 18 months of departure from democracy, when the emergency was declared and civil liberties were suspended.
Right.
So I was not yet 14, but becoming politically active at that point. So I remember in 1977 when emergency was lifted, I actually went around from door to door campaigning, and that was it was a period in which I think students in most parts of India, and certainly it seemed to me most parts of the globe, were much more politically involved. So it was largely around Indian politics and social issues at that point.
Yeah. I remember that very clearly because IIT Delhi was right next to Jawaharlal Nehru University, and there was a lot of this stuff going on there. But I remember that was, sort of the masses had gotten involved. But like, how should universities deal with issues, where students sort of want to express themselves and disagree? How should universities just think about that, right? Because we've had that happen in the US, like recently, like over the spring semester, like a lot of universities were caught off guard. I think NYU came out looking pretty good, from what I could see, relative to some of our peers. But how should university leaders think about these situations where students like want to express, differences? Like, how should they think about it?
I'll answer that at a more general level, right? I think in all contexts, I think the right to freedom of speech is a vital one and one that we must preserve. But the right to freedom of speech cannot come at the expense of threatening someone else's freedom in any way. So I think this has always been a delicate balance that institutions try to manage at all points, and it's not an easy balance at the best of times. It's not possible to give a black and white answer to this, but it's always a trade-off, right? So in any context, if my right to do so, you're having dinner at a restaurant, I go sit at the table next to you and start screaming or singing at the top of my voice. I can't sing to save my life, so I'm using that example specifically. Then my right to sing affects your right to have a quiet dinner.
Yeah.
So in every sense of the word, our rights to do things have to be taken into account with what we are also affecting. So I think that's a delicate balance that in any situation, any institution has to take that balance into account in terms of how it's affecting its own functioning and the rights of all members of its community.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally reasonable. It's just, things get kind of heated, in these situations. But I mean, what you're saying makes total sense, right? I mean, this is, there's many interests, many groups, many sensibilities, and we have a right to express ourselves, but I guess
not only that, I think also an obligation to discuss our differences with a modicum of respect for the other group.
Yes,
I think it's very, very necessary. Dissension should not be confused with disloyalty. I think that is really a fundamental point, that somebody who disagrees with you is not necessarily being disagreeable in any sense of the word. It could just be an honest disagreement. So one thing that universities uniquely have the ability to do is to bring people together to discuss things. And
yeah, no, I mean, they are very special places, in that sense, right? I don't know. I mean, the way I see it is it's really all about the truth at the end of the day, right? I mean, it's sort of the pursuit of truth. And whatever gets us there is a good thing. Just sort of want to wrap up with some thoughts around, what sort of advice you give to students these days, like say high school students, in their teens, thinking of going to universities. How should they think about the world that's going to emerge, right? I mean, and I just want to, I guess, provide a little bit of context to this, which is that, at one time, employment used to be, for life, right? You joined a company and you sort of moved up the ladder. That changed, right? It's much more fluid. Technology's changed things, right? So we're in this position where we're trying to teach people how to think. I mean, how should young people think about what they want to get out of a university education these days, considering the world that is emerging?
So, Vasant, I think that question is almost impossible to answer at one level because I think almost everything we could have predicted about the world in 1984 would have been wrong by 1994 in terms of the direction things take and so on. The only thing that, just look at what happened in that period, right? Like, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A few years later, you had the Russian default, the East Asian crisis. Then you had the internet bubble. You had 9/11. You had the two Gulf Wars. You had it's very, very hard to predict the direction the world is going in at any point. So that's not I don't want to get into the crystal ball game. I'm always reminded of, I think it was Google's futurist who said that if you're lucky enough to live till 2029, each year at that point will add 1 year to your life expectancy. Every year will add 1 more year to your life expectancy. And I tried to play this mental game with myself of, then what is my life expectancy actually going to be?
But there is one constant, I think, in all of this, which is that the expectations keep going up. I don't know how to put this. But,
right? We look back and think we grew up in a much less competitive time. We grew up in a time when, things were a lot easier. People didn't sweat so much about getting into the right college.
Right.
All of that is true to an extent, but that only points to me to the fact that fewer people had those opportunities. When competition arises, people rise to the competition. So when times change, people, that's one of my favorite Latin sayings, right? Tempora mutantur, nos et mutantur nihilus. Times change and we are changed by the times. Things do happen, and it does feel like the world is getting a lot more competitive, a lot more. But that is also, to me, a sign of economic opportunity having increased enormously. Competition is not amongst the few people who are coming out of a few institutions, going to a few other places. There is something very positive about the direction of the world in many ways. There's lots that are negative about the world. Above all, I think the only thing, when you ask me about high school students, the only thing I always tell them is, keep your mind open and explore as much as possible. When you're in college, you'll never get those 4 years back to explore to your heart's content on what you like. And some things you may love, but you may not want to do as a profession. But you may want to continue doing it, and you'll never know it if you don't explore enough. I think that willingness to continually learn is really the most important characteristic. I think looking back on at the internet bubble, now, 2 years before the internet bubble, it seemed like the world was changing so dramatically. And but a lot of it, we later realized, looking back, was just...
Yeah, what you just said right there, just expect to keep learning,
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, the expectations have gone up. I think the resources that we have available... Yeah, you can do stuff in one day that would take you months to do. In terms of, let's say, going to the library, looking for things. In many ways, our productivity has gone up by orders of magnitude, right?
Absolutely.
And that's raised expectations. And to me, it's created amazing possibilities. I tell students that I'm just so envious where you're starting, right, relative to where we started, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that change is tremendous. And And in that sense, it sort of raises expectations. Right? You can expect to do so much
phenomenally,
more.
because information is at your fingertips now in a way that it wasn't in the past, right? So if you and I, at the time when we were studying, there were few textbooks, and that's where you learned stuff from.
Yeah.
But today, information on any subject, you can Google it and get it in like seconds.
Absolutely. But you have to have the capacity to actually take that information and do something with it, right?
So this is, to me, going back to our early part of our discussion, the difference between systematic studying in a college environment, for example, in any course environment, where you learn step by step, you learn something, and just random learning on your own. You could pick up almost anything on your own. But the systematic learning, which teaches you how to use it and how to develop on it, that is what is really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the tools we have available now are amazing.
Fantastic.
Compared to what we had. Well, Raghu, thanks so much for this conversation. Really appreciated it. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. And I just had a lot of fun chatting. So thanks again for doing this.
Thank you, Vasant. Always great to see you. Thank you.